Good afternoon, everybody. Excuse my tardiness.
No
How are we?
worries.
I feel like it's been so long since we've done this.
I know. I was just saying I had to look up what we were reading a couple weeks ago, and then I was like, oh. So
I I thought the 3 month thing would maybe the timing to have like a 2 hour book in like a 3 month period wasn't like the greatest call because I remember once we decided on, I was like, sweet, I'll read it, and then like 3 days later, I was like, okay, I guess I'll start reading everything else. So, tried to re-jog the memory a little bit, but welcome back to the book club. And this month our book was The War of Art by Stephen Pressfield. So this is a book I see recommended quite a bit, and I think sometimes that actually works against the book because you almost go into it with a certain level of hype or expectation based on more to do with your feelings of the person to recommend it and what they're kind of about, as opposed to like giving the book kudos on its own merits. So maybe that's a bit of an allure to what I felt about the book, but we'll go around. We'll start. Mags, I'll start with you. How'd you find it? What'd you think? Key takeaways, favorite part, favorite moment?
Yeah, so I was just saying before you hopped on that, at the beginning, the first couple of chapters, I was super fired up, just the way that he defines what resistance is. And I think it speaks to a lot of what we do in our practice as well, in terms of nutrition and health and wellness, not the difference between that immediate gratification and then long-term growth and health, and integrity. And in the heat of the moment, which one are you going to decide? And oftentimes resistance will lead you to choose that more like immediate gratification rather than pursuing something that could kind of serve you more longer term. So I was really fired up about that. I'm like, this is gonna be great. And I don't want to write it off as not a good read by any means, but I think that, and I'm sure we'll get into the thick of it, but I think that how should I put this? I think that it may be like, I don't know, overcomplicated, I guess, the concept of like pursuing your passions and that sort of thing. But yeah, I'll kind of leave my initial thoughts there and we can come back.
Laura?
Yeah, I probably felt similarly. Maybe the only other piece I'll add that I did kind of like was the validation around like fear and fear being normal and like that piece, because I do think that's something that sometimes gets overlooked. We see people that create these great things and we assume that it's like super easy for them. And I guess part of the magic of the art is making it look easy. But I think even just like pulling back the curtain from that a little bit was helpful. But I don't know if I loved the kind of takeaways and thoughts and ideas he had in terms of like overcoming the resistance, but we can get into that a bit more.
Jess?
I'm on similar trains of thoughts as everyone so far. I did like, it's like he talks about the power is in your hands, to make change and overcome resistance and overcome that victim mentality and stuff, which I really like. But yeah, similarly to Meg and Lauren, I think when things get too dogmatic, it's like nothing is black and white to me. And a lot of his stuff was like, you're either a pro or an amateur. And there was no like bleeding into each other. And I just don't think it's that black and white. And I think you can be strong and vulnerable, and you can be these dichotomy of things without being an amateur. I don't think it makes you weak. You can be strong, you can be weak. Yeah. Anyway, so I enjoyed it. And again, I don't think it's a bad read, but I also think it's like way far down that extreme spectrum.
Yeah. Extreme on a lot of fronts, I think too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we're kind of all on the same page. Similar to Mags, when I was reading it, I was like, oh, I'm going to really enjoy this. Like, this is going to be really good. And then when it got to about halfway in and it kind of switched to be less about like personal growth and development and more about like, oh, your destiny is predetermined by God anyway. And it's like your basically like need to fulfill like what you're in here to do. I was like that's when I started to be like, I think I'm tapping out, and now I'm just like increasing the speed of the Audible to just kind of like get through it. I think one of the interesting themes though, and maybe Jess, like this is kind of where you feel too, is what my idea of like what that actually means when people start talking about God per se has probably changed a lot over like the last 10 to 15 years. Like we grew up like Roman Catholic, where like the idea of God is like this guy that like sits in the clouds and just like throws lightning bolts, and it's like everyone gets, you know, like it's sort of like that was the idea of God. But I think as I've gotten older, like that idea is more that there's something within each of us that is like better than what we are, and your life is basically how you try to get to that point and always aspire to be and do more. And like growth is uncomfortable. So there's two parts of the book where I was like, this is something I really need to hear, that yeah, everything you try to do that's going to be worth anything isn't going to be easy, and there's going to be times and periods of self-doubt, but that's just part of the process. And so as soon as you accept that it's going to be difficult, it's going to be hard, there's going to be times when you want to quit, and that's probably why at the end of the day, like it will be worth doing. Like it kind of it removes that fear, right? It's not inherently just me that I'm finding this difficult. This is just because I'm trying to do a difficult thing that I've never done before. Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I wrote down he wrote a quote because similar kind of to what you're touching on. He said, most of us have two lives, the life we live and the unlived life within us. Between the two stands of resistance. And I was just like, but that was kind of touching on that predetermined, you have a thing you're supposed to be doing. And I just don't believe that. I believe God is whatever you want it to be in universe. And this isn't a chat about God, but I think, I think, I don't think there's a predetermined path for people, even though sometimes I'm like, oh, I feel like I'm where I should be and doing what I should be doing. It doesn't mean that was like, you're set to do one thing. Cause then he continues on to talk about, it was easier for Hitler to start World War II than to face a blank square of canvas and be a painter. And I was like, I just really struggled with that analogy. I was like, is it? So yeah, as similar to you, Ben, I was just like, there was a few things I couldn't get on board with. Yeah.
It's an interesting conversation to balance. Like, if you believe that everything's predetermined and there's a destiny, it's like, well, then surely amounting to nothing has just been your destiny. Because if it's been predetermined, how do you make a wrong choice? Right. So, yeah, which again is like all things being one thing, right? Like that's the dichotomy that you were talking about before. It's like every pro was once an amateur, but if you never make it to the next level, well, how do you determine that you just weren't supposed to make it to that point, right? Maybe this is just your lot, So, yeah.
One thing I thought was interesting is we always seem to pick books that he didn't directly, I don't know which came first, Brene Brown or this book, but he does talk about the concept of an arena a lot. And the first place that I heard that was from Brene Brown's work. And I heard that, I was like, well, of course, we always seem to choose books that kind of relate back to Brene Brown's work. So I thought that was interesting just because of the reference that I made to Brene Brown. For some context, I wrote down a quote about it. It's better to be in the arena getting stomped by the bull than to be in the stands or out in the parking lot. Again, I have mixed feelings about this concept. But I think the part that I do agree with is that, like Laura was speaking to, it's not always going to be easy, right? And it's okay for it to be difficult, and we can expect, pursuing our passions, pursuing our dreams, whatever it may be, to be difficult. But then again, on the flip side, I don't think, we should always be expecting or putting ourselves in positions to be getting stomped by the bull constantly, right? And sometimes it's okay to not be putting yourself under immense amounts of pressure and everything like that, just because we're getting to where, we're telling ourselves we need to be, or we think somebody else is telling us we need to be there. So yeah, I thought that was interesting.
Sounds like your resistance talking, Mads.
I do think, like, I felt similarly to what you're saying, Maggie, that like especially when they talk about like being a pro is like just doing it and like putting all the like other things aside, and like it doesn't matter your mood, and like you just show up every day. And like to some extent, yes. And I think we talk about this a lot when we talk about like going to the gym and stuff, and how you're maybe not motivated every day, but you build a habit around that. But I don't think that means you pick the time to go to the gym that's like the least favorite because it's the most difficult and like you're overcoming the most. Like I think there's still ways to set yourself up to be in more of that flow state. Like if you're trying to be, you know, more creative, like if I have a piece of work that I have to do that's more of like a sit down and create, like I know there's, for me, times in my morning that I'm a lot better at that. I know I need to put away distractions. And I think there's like a middle ground too. Like he was very far to the extreme of just like do whatever it takes. And like, I think there is some discussion too about like, yes, it's going to be hard, but how can we make it easier or like more aligned to how we work and how we do things?
Yeah. That kind of like that dichotomy of opposites kind of holding true, I think, is very real. Like I know even with your day-to-day stuff, like the more structured I can try to make my time, like the more freedom that actually creates. Like when you start to do little things repeatedly, like if I say at 9 a.m. I'm going to do an hour's worth of emails every day and try to make that a habit, then even though you're being quite regimented and structured, like you get it done, and the habit becomes having that done for the rest of the day. And that ticks into other things like starting your day with those big accomplishments and those big wins, and you do get on a roll and you do gain momentum. And I think it's ironic that sometimes like creativity can work the same way. Like putting time aside for yourself to specifically work on something is quite a regimented and structured way to do it, even though that something is something creative. But if you're not allowing yourself specific time to do that, then like the days have a habit of getting away from you, right? Like how many days have you had, Jess, especially over lockdown, where it's like, I've done fucking nothing and it's like 6 p.m. at night. Like I've done nothing all day. Maybe I've got a workout in and that's it. And yeah, sometimes like having nothing needs to be part of the overall plan long term. But it is like we're yet to find a book on balance, right? Like it's either like completely one way where it's like, you know, like things will happen and whatever, and timing is everything, and you're where you're meant to be. And then like the other end of the spectrum is like Dave Goggins, who like when it's not cold enough goes and lies in the, you know, the pond in his mum's backyard so that he can simulate like freezing cold temperature water, you know. So I think that there is that beauty in being exposed to both extremes and then figuring out where you particularly sit and are at your best on that spectrum, right? Yeah. Yeah, Mags, if you like, you got something to say, something stirring.
I have an interesting, well, I think it's an interesting question, but it's moving off of that topic. So I just want to make sure no one else had anything to add. In one of the sections, he was talking about the similarities, but more so the differences between, I think it was like creative endeavor versus professionalism, or pros versus amateurs. And I think it was the creative endeavor versus professional. And one of the things he mentioned was identifying. So identifying as your profession and identifying as your creative endeavor, and how pros do not identify as their profession. And sometimes when people are pursuing their creative endeavor, they tend to identify personally as this endeavor. And this is something that resistance loves to try and knock you off of. And I think in our particular professions, in our roles as, you know, health and wellness leaders and coaches and that sort of thing, I think that line becomes quite blurry. So I was wondering what everyone kind of thinks about that concept of like identifying with what we do.
It's a great question.
Yes.
Yeah, that's deep. I mean, I believe it's okay to identify with what you do professionally, as long as it's in that spectrum and in the middle somewhere, you know, not as an extreme either side. I believe like the business, like I am a trainer, I'm a coach, like I feed off people, like I couldn't imagine doing anything else. So I think, you know, as long as I think you have boundaries around it, like I try not to take the work home as best as I can. And I, you know, I don't let small things try and ruin my day, which I think again are skills and resistance you have to learn. But yeah, I think it's okay as long as it doesn't impact your quality of life negatively. You know, for me, my business and my work positively affects my life in a very good way. And maybe I'm saying that from a bias because I'm in it and I'm here and I'm loving it and it's new and fresh. But yeah, that's my small take.
I think
Laura?
I've tried really hard in my adult years to not identify by what I do, because I was like an athlete in university. I did varsity sports, and I spent my whole life working for that and work towards that. And then one day it's done and it's over. And I, along with I think a lot of other people I golfed with, you have a bit of like a crisis of consciousness of like, who am I? What am I doing? I've spent my whole life doing this. And I really struggled, I think, through the last bit of university because of that. And what I took from it, and there's a documentary that's really good that goes through the kind of crash that Olympic gold medalists face after they come back home and that whole bit. And I think that I experienced that to a smaller extent in university. And I think from that, what I took was that for me, I need to have a little bit more separation between like what I do and who I am. And that's not to say that there isn't a linkage. And, you know, I do obviously see a lot of the things I do as like things that play into my personality or play into all this other stuff. But I've tried hard to kind of separate the two a little bit for that reason and see it more as like, these are all the things that I do that make me me, but I am not just those things. And I'm also, you know, other aspects.
Yeah. I think that's really well put. I think we kind of see the best and the worst of the dangers of taking something to a level of identity. Like in Atomic Habits, like James Clear is really big on things like, you know, if you're trying to start a new habit and you're trying to overcome old habits in the moment of trying to overcome an old habit, you know, if you're trying to be more athletic, it's like, well, what would an athletic person do in this situation? And trying to actually make more of those decisions, because if you can identify as an athletic person, then more of your decisions will stem from following those kind of like decision-making protocols. But at the same time, when you see someone who, you know, takes things like their political views or their dietary protocols and try to embody them as part of their identity, how hard does it then become for that person to potentially change their mind? Which ultimately, whenever we're having a conversation with anyone, if we don't possess the ability to be, you know, able to change our mind when we're presented with new information or new evidence that might support or contrary positions that which we have, we're worse off for that, not better off, right? So I think that there again, on that spectrum, there is levels of both. I read this really thing the other day where, you know, similar to what Laura said, like if you took away all your titles, like what are you left with? And I think that I kind of see my life as like this whole journey of trying to really discover like who I am and what does that mean. And it's hard not to identify as something, right? Like as a small business owner, as a nutritionist, as a coach, as a father, as a husband. Like if you take those things away from me, what am I left with? And that's what I'm trying to figure out, right? So I definitely think in the moment, like short term, you know, when you're working with a client, identifying as a coach and making decisions that a coach would make and being able to separate an emotive decision from a data-based decision or an outcome-based decision is incredibly useful. But at the same time, if I'm not a coach, does that mean I'm no longer valuable to that person as a soundboard or as a resource? So yeah.
That everything all three of you said definitely resonates with me. I think something that I've been trying to do lately from both the perspective of an athlete, as a coach in our professions, is it's not necessarily about like, I'm trying not to define myself in accordance to what I achieve or where I'm going or what I'm pursuing, but more so how you do it, and what values you're carrying with you as you pursue these different areas of your life, and trying to focus more on that rather than, and this is going back again to probably something I learned from Brene Brown and her values. But yeah, so focusing more on like, what's that, the means to the end rather than the end or whatever.
Do you remember, Mags, the conversation we had, this probably would have been a year ago, and we were saying how we actually need to stop calling ourselves just coaches and actually realize that primarily we're educators who coach, because if we're just determining ourselves as coaches, we're actually limiting what we are doing, because like that kind of places limits on realms that applies specifically to. But if we can relabel that role as only one role of a few roles that as educators we provide, then that means that like part of what we do is resource development or social media or seminar presentations. It's not just like one-to-one individual coaching, right? So yeah, I think that where it comes to labels and how we identify, you want that to be broad. You don't want to place like any kind of perceived or literal limitations on like what you're able to do and what direction, you know, that takes, because for the most part, what we're doing right now, each as individuals, may just be the step to the next thing. And in 5 years' time, we might be looking back, and regardless of where Project Better is or where MTMM is, it might be like, that was a really cool 10-year ride, and I can't believe the point it's taken me to now, right? So I think that as much as I couldn't ever see myself doing anything else, I think that you need to be open to the fact that where you are and what you are is just setting you up for whatever that next stage is too, right? Yeah.
Going back to the whole, like, what's your path, and, you know, how much control do you have over it, to kind of tie that all back into the book.
Yeah. Yeah. 2 hours. He definitely packed a lot in. I usually listen to my audibles at like 1.1 speed. I had to slow him down. Like, it was just like, it's almost like he was nervous in the audible booth, and he was like, I'm just going to read through it. You know, when someone presents and they're just like, you're obviously nervous because they're reading at 100 miles an hour. That's what it kind of felt like.
Well, and the sections were so short too. It was almost like he just defined something and then moved on. It wasn't like define, dig in, move on. It was just like define, move on.
Yeah.
You don't really have, especially because I also listen to it on faster speed. You don't have time to really like think about each concept as he's just kind of blowing through them.
Yeah. It kind of reminded me a little bit of, have you guys read Relentless by Tim Grover? Where it was like, it was kind of like a book about headlines. Like Mag said, it was like, boom, here's a point. Here's like 2 or 3 lines. Boom, next point. And this book is just a compilation of like my top 100 thoughts. But not that those thoughts necessarily coherently related to all the other thoughts. It was like, here it is, done. Here it is, done. It's like, okay. Tim Grover, his book Relentless. And again, this is another one of those books that it's like, oh, on everyone's top 10 list, it's like War on Art and The Superior Way of the Man. And it's just like all these books that I'm reading, like Napoleon Hill's Think and Grow Rich. I'm like, these books aren't good. Like I think there's a number of books that get recommended because they're always recommended, and that's why they're getting recommended. And I kind of feel like this is one of those books. It's not that I didn't love it. It's that, yeah, maybe my expectation of how often I'd seen it kind of brought up and recommended kind of overinflated how good or how, you know, influential I thought it would be. And like I said, that's not to say that there's no takeaways from the book. And I quite like that idea as someone who struggles with having big ideas and then worrying myself out of them because the execution is not going to be perfect and then doing nothing. Some of the themes that he mentioned specifically early on really resonated, and those will be my takeaways. But at the same time, this is not going to be something that I'm like, you have to read Stephen Pressfield's War on Art.
I think I agree with you. Like, I read Relentless. It's very similar. It's very, you're all this, no days off, you know, there's no middle ground, which again, I didn't love. But I think, I mean, it's like when you do a course, you know, you take a little bit away, you take what you need, you can leave what you need. But I don't know if it's like, it's not well-rounded enough for me to start suggesting it as a must read to people. You know what I mean? So agreed.
I think the conversations that it sparked are interesting as well, even if we're not agreeing necessarily with what he said. I think considering the opposing side, or, you know, different opinions is also a takeaway in and of itself as well.
Just make sure we don't identify too strongly with one thing.
Yeah.
I don't find middle ground.
Yeah.
Want to really settle in, really dig your feet in about what you're not. Right? Sorry, Laura.
No, that's all I was going to say. Find your middle ground. Like, I think when you hear the extremes, that's how you find like where that middle spot is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you, gang. We've gone for half an hour, which is almost as long as the book itself. Great to see everyone. It's been so long, but I think what we'll do is if you guys can each chuck up your book recommendations, I'll put a little bit of a post in the MTMM Book Club. And for anyone who's listening to it, Again, like love to hear your thoughts and love to hear some recommendations from you about what we should read next. And that will be like our holiday, our festive Christmas read, which for our Canadian fam is like the perfect time to start to curl up inside where it's not nice and cold. And for our Melbourne fam, like finally allowed out. So it's kind of the opposite. So putting it in to run with, I guess, Jess.
Yeah, I might have to switch from Audible to physical.
Actual. I guess having 3 months now, I'd actually consider doing the same thing because it's like enough time that you don't have to necessarily multitask to get through your books. Like you can actually read.
Mm-hmm.
I'm banned from buying books. I have these bookshelves everywhere and like they're full. Audible's at least like discreet.
Laura, I had this mentioned to Kat the other day that I actually wanted to buy a bookcase and then my favorite books that we've read actually buy the hard copy just so I could have a bookshelf to be like, these are my favorite books. Even though like they wouldn't necessarily have to take them out of the wrapper.
I have my A, B, and C bookshelves. I have like this bookshelf is like the C bookshelf. So it's like not my favorites, but like the one in my room and then the one downstairs are like my more favorites. So I've like organized them that way. I feel like it's a good approach.
Do you do that? Does anyone do that? If you really like an Audible, will you then go and buy a hard copy of the same book so that you can like annotate and work through? I've done it with Atomic Habits. I found that super helpful.
I did it with Brene.
Yeah.
Not
Big
usually,
fan
but
over here.
Sorry, Jess.
I said not usually. I have like a million, but I like love buying books, but then I just listen to everything on Audible. So I don't know. It's a problem.
So you go the other way. I bought this great book to listen to it.
Yeah, basically.
Easy. All right, guys. Lovely to see you all. And we will reconvene. What are we now? November, December, Jan, Feb?
End of Jan?
End of Jan? Yeah.
Yeah. Great.
22.
All right. Hopefully we're still.
Fingers crossed.
Thank you, guys.
Bye, guys.
Bye.